Hello and welcome. This is a presentation by Brendon Hubbard, a portfolio manager at ClucasGray on Grindrod and rail reform. What makes Grindrod so compelling? They've got monopoly type assets, important logistics. We've got imminent rail reform in South Africa we expect in the next few weeks. We've got 70 billion rand annual revenue pot in rail, which is not previously available to the private sector. It's a very high EBITDA margin industry internationally, 35 to 50% odd. High barriers to entry, few participants available in South Africa to undertake the work, and there's no controlling shareholder as it stands. What makes rail reform so compelling is that you have about 35 billion rands worth of turnover at Transnet Freight Rail. Plus, in this slide from Transnet's presentation, it shows lost revenue, and they break it down per locomotive type. But I mean, the important number for us is this 37.6 billion rand, which they highlight, which they left behind. And I mean, we can double check that against numbers given to us by the mining houses, what was left behind, and what they can't get to the ports. Another way to look at this is really, this is from the University of Stellenbosch. It's their research showing what the cost is of Transnet on the economy, and they break it down by different commodity types, as you can see across here. And general freight and containers. And essentially going back to 2021, you can see their research would indicate that it cost the economy 3.2% of growth. 2022, during the Ukraine war, when commodity prices spiked up, particularly coal, that cost South Africa 6.7% of GDP growth. And in 2023, that cost South Africa 5.5% growth. So this is really a reform that South Africa desperately needs to get this economy moving. So this comment on the right-hand side is from the white paper on national rail policy. It says Transnet is an uncompetitively positioned, ineffectively equipped, operationally inefficient railway that has lost its ability to both dominate local logistics and mobility markets to support global exports. So there it is from the South African government telling you that Transnet, in their opinion, is in trouble, and hence the requirement to get the private sector moving. I think this cartoon on the left sort of talks to what's happening at corporate boardrooms, particularly the mining houses who are sitting on a lot of cash, billions of rands in their balance sheet. They haven't been ordering locomotives, which typically take 2 years to get into the country, and this is heavily impacting their performances. I mean, the good news is the tide is turning. So what I think the important one is this March 2022, the white paper on national rail policy. Was in March, signed off in March 2022. There's been a number of other sort of movements. It was very slow under the Department of Public Enterprises. We've seen a big acceleration from the Department of Transport. So a big shout out to the Department of Transport at the speed at which they're moving. The big ones, for example, is the network statement, which came out in December 2024. That laid out, for example, the toll fees. And then the next that we're waiting for, the last piece in the puzzle, is the access agreement, which should be out in the next few weeks, and that'll then allow the private sector to start running. So this process is moving. Department of Transport are doing a good job, and we expect movement soon. So this slide shows what rail reform would look like, and I mean the best way to explain it is to look at the setup of toll roads in South Africa. So basically, the government owns the road through SANRail. They then give a concession to a party whose job it is to put the capex in, get it up to a specific design, collect the toll fees, do the maintenance, and then hand it back to government after a certain period. And then that allows your trucking companies to run down that road. So very similar setup in rail is that the government will own the track. It'll go to a concession, and that's necessary because the amount of capex that needs to go into these lines to get them back to the right speeds, and then that'll allow the train operating companies, so the example of being Transnet themselves, Traction, Grindrod, to run across the lines. The difference between these two really lies in penalties for breakdowns. So I mean, if you look at, for example, this picture here kind of depicts it. If a truck breaks down on the N3, very easy to pull over onto the side and let vehicles behind it pass. That obviously is a big problem on rail, and so if you launch a train out of, for example, Durban heading for Joburg, you've got to make sure the train gets to Joburg. If it doesn't, you get hit with big penalties for holding up the people behind you. So South Africa's got a very large track infrastructure, as big as Germany, and certainly the largest in Africa. But the key corridors and the important ones are these bulk mineral corridors. So I mean, very simply, this is the Sishen Saldanha, that red one there. This red one here is the coal corridor. That there is iron ore coming from Palabora into Maputo. You've got the Durban-Joburg Natcor corridor. You've got the manganese corridor, which is this one over here. And then you've got the north-south corridor, which is cargoes coming from Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana into South Africa, heading for the ports. So those are the important corridors that people are after. Unfortunately, when it comes to, for example, the feeder network or the shorter lines, you just don't have the capex to put into those lines to keep them up, and those will ultimately, if they haven't already been pulled up, they will be. The other issue is obviously passenger rail is just not profitable for the private sector. It requires very large subsidies, and even look at the London Underground. There's one of the densest passenger train systems in the world, and it requires subsidies. So really, the money is in the bulk minerals corridors, which you can think about as conveyor belts. So if we look at the Transnet numbers, I mean, the important thing is if you go back in history, before state capture, they were running at 42% EBITDA margins. You can see now their targets is to get to this kind of back to this 40 sort of level, 40.7, 37.2. Unfortunately, they're currently running at the 20% level. Their net debt to EBITDA is the really big problem. So, I mean, you can see typically a private sector business on the JSE, if its net debt to EBITDA exceeds 3 times, the bank would typically want debt to be reduced or to be recapitalized. And you can see here that Transnet 11.5, 2023, and in 2024 9.7. So these numbers are just way too high, and this is the big problem for Transnet going forward. So I mean, Transnet is a big animal. We do need it to survive. It's really important for South Africa, and there is mechanisms to get this business turned around. So I mean, a couple of issues. First is I don't think, talking to the mining industry, they will not pull 1 ton from Transnet. Rather, it'll be volumes that get taken from the truck cargoes, which are obviously a lot more expensive. And any new mines that get built, that incremental tonnage will be given to the private sector. But we don't expect any tonnage, certainly in the next decade, to be pulled from Transnet. So, the core business of Transnet remains sound. The track infrastructure has now been moved into a business called TRIM, and rail operations go to a business called T-Rock. Currently, Transnet move about 150 million tons. Government want to take it up to 250 million tons. And if you take a 250 times an average trip of, call it 500 kilometers, at the average toll fee of roughly about 10 cents, that gets you to a number of about 12.5 billion rand in toll fees. On top of that, T-Rock, the original Transnet business, better run, delivering 35% EBITDA margins, should be able to generate about 12 billion rand. And then the other business important in there is that they're talking about is Leaseco. So you can see Transnet sit with an enormous amount of locomotives and a huge fleet of wagons, which are completely underutilized. And hence the saying, they're asset rich and cash flow poor. And that could generate another 1.5 billion rands worth of EBITDA. But, this is all about management and getting this right, and, doing simple things like, why there are no trackers on these trains for accounting and management control. But, rail reform is not a threat to Transnet. In fact, it's an opportunity for them to refocus on their highly profitable lines and to walk away from the unprofitable corridors. So, I mean, just going through the numbers quickly. So I've shown you 250 million tons that could generate across the greater group 26 billion of EBITDA. They need about 14 billion to cover their debt. They need a lot more money, obviously, to go back into maintenance and into capex. But the important point is that they will be able to shed all these unprofitable corridors. And a good example in that is the Natcor corridor. That's running at a very low capacity at the moment. And that corridor loses Transnet 3.1 billion rand per annum. And that corridor, for example, would be better utilized, handed to the private sector, taking their locomotives and to moving them across to the corridors where they can sweat the assets better and get a better return. TFR Transnet is also completely overstaffed with 34,000 employees. And you would expect them to make a database available to new private operators and to try and reduce that headcount to get them into profitability. But it's quite unusual for a transport business around the world where the staff costs exceed fuel costs. So there is unusually strong support for rail reform in South Africa, which is unusual for the unions in particular. They have been the party that's faced all the retrenchments in the mining sector, and more importantly in the coal sector. As a mine, you can't just keep mining and building up big stockpiles. Ultimately, you need to start retrenching and you need to start closing mines, and that's what's been happening across South Africa, despite the decent price for coal and the global demand. The other party that I was worried about was the trucking industry. We run the world's 11th largest truck fleet. But it turns out that trucks sitting and stuck in for days and end in harbours and sitting at border posts trying to cross is just not profitable. The trucking industry is better and more profitable in an integrated hub and spoke system with rail, where they earn a higher return. The other party is obviously the finance industry, which held up some of the electricity reforms, but I think they seem to be more comfortable with the process underway in rail. But monopolies don't die easy. There's a quote from Adam Smith: "Monopoly is a great enemy of good management." So one of the frequently asked questions is really around copper theft. This is a global problem. It's obviously more acute in South Africa. The solution is to take these lines back to running on diesel and take out the overhead copper lines. The longer term solution is obviously to move them to LNG. LNG is much cheaper as a fuel. It's also more difficult to steal, and it's more environmentally friendly. And if you look, for example, at Kumba, they run their ships now on LNG. So and locomotives globally, you're seeing them moving more towards the LNG solution. But fortunately, most corridors for Grindrod are not electrified. Right, so it was the rail regulator in South Africa that suggested to me that you go and have a look at the Rumo Brazil example. So what happened was Brazil had a state-owned rail operator that went bust in 2008, and Rumo were one of the first parties to get going. They went off and bought old second-hand locos and got their operations going back in 2008. And if we look at this business today, we can see that in terms of the market capitalization of this business, as it stands at the moment, we're somewhere between 100 odd billion rands worth of market cap. Remember, these numbers on Bloomberg have been converted to rands. So from a standing start of almost nothing up to 100 billion talks to how big these industries are. In terms of revenue, very similar numbers. You can see, Transnet runs at about 35 billion rand worth of turnover, and you can see at 20, 31, 40, you can see these guys climbing, but historically been in that same sort of range. And then importantly, if we look down here at these EBITDA margins, so you can see how they're kind of in the 40 to 50% range consistently. Brazil is also important because it's got a similar cost of capital to South Africa when you look at these valuations. And they've also got very similar cargo types to South Africa. So who are the participants? This is a high barriers to entry industry. It requires skilled and regulated staff. It also requires very large balance sheets. So one new coal train will set you back 560 million rand, and that'll move just over 20,000 tons. It's also, these industries are hugely complex, these rail operations. And as I said to you, we don't anticipate Transnet losing any volumes for at least the next decade. So Transnet, obviously a big player at the bottom here. Traction are Africa's largest private rail operator. Then you've got Grindrod as the second largest, and we anticipate MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company, entering into South Africa. Right, then looking at Grindrod specifically, this graph here talks to the volume growth that you've seen coming through on their port operations. So very strong growth, compound annual growth of 23% over the period. Terminals, you've seen this pull back slightly here, and this is to do with the Richards Bay conveyor belt, which had a fire, and we expect that to kick back up again in the near future. Maputo is an important asset for Grindrod. They own 25% of it. The other 25% are owned by Dubai World, and then 50% by the Mozambican government. It's got about 31 million tons goes through the port. There's a big expansion underway from 400 meters of quay up to 650. That's this area, and they're expanding it into this area. You can see they move a lot of chrome, for example, through here. That's all the chrome dumps that you can see there, including ferrochrome. This is the car terminal and the gas layout area that they own 100% of this, and this is quite an important asset I'll show you for the northern Mozambique. And then about 60% of volumes come into the port currently by truck, and they are busy trying to get that moved to rail. The Mozambican government's doing a big upgrade on the line, taking it from 13 million tonnes to 40 million tonnes. The other important asset for Grindrod is the port of Matola, sitting in Maputo. They own 100% of this. Its design capacity is 7 million tonnes of iron ore and coal. But you can see in the month of May 2025, they did over 1 million tonnes in 1 month. They're looking to install a new ship loader. So here's the old ship loader, so it'll be even bigger and faster than this one. And there you can see this is where the ships sit, and then the rail comes in over here, and then this is the coal and iron ore that's stored there waiting for export. Richards Bay is also a very important asset for them. It's where they're going to build the first privately operated container port in South Africa. So that's going down the bottom here. It's into this area here where you can see these 3 ships sitting. They've also got the Valley Terminal, which sits up there. They've got the Navigar Terminal, and these move materials on this big conveyor belt system through here onto the ships. You can see this conveyor belt system. There they move sulfur, phosphates, specialist coal. Capacity of this at the moment is 3.1 million tonnes, but that can be taken up to 20 million tonnes. In Durban Port, they run maiden wharf operations. That's a couple of these buildings down here, and they move everything, bulk cargo, anything from aircraft engines to cement. They've also got this roller Grindrod clearing and forwarding business, which is quite a large operation in South Africa. So Grindrod is in a JV with Maersk when it comes to containers, and they typically move somewhere between 15 and 20% of all containers moving through South Africa. They've also got this business called Ocean Africa. It's a small container line business. It moves containers around South Africa and the Indian Ocean islands of Seychelles, Mauritius, Reunion, those sort of places. They've also got the City Deep operation. So this is the M2 highway going through Joburg. It's quite a large operation, but what's important here is they've got a nice big rail head where they can load containers and put them straight into Durban Port. So as soon as rail reform kicks off, this will be an important asset for them. So this is the $20 billion LNG project being built by Total in northern Mozambique. Before it went into force majeure, Grindrod were supplying this area with 13 ferries. They were bringing trucks up, so it's very difficult to bring a truck by road up here, long distance, bad roads. So they get brought up on these massive ferries, and they get brought into this harbour area that you can see over here that's been built. They're expecting this project to restart now in August, September 2025. And if you go back to before force majeure, I mean, Grindrod were making about 100 million of EBITDA on these northern Mozambican operations. Grindrod's rail business, they are Africa's second largest private operator. They've got a fleet of 44 locomotives and 88 wagons, which they're looking to build out further. They've currently got 13 locomotives that have been returned back from Sierra Leone, where they were running about 10 million tonnes of iron ore. They're also looking to lease further wagons to get about six train sets on the Maputo corridor, and that will be taking material, you'll see in a moment, from Belfast into Maputo. This photo shows the Grindrod workshops, and these are the locomotives brought back from Sierra Leone that are busy being refitted and will be ready for rail reform when it kicks off in the next few weeks. Right, this map talks to the different corridors. So, I mean, this is an important one. This is from Belfast into Matola, where they're going to be taking, in this case, coal from this Belfast area, all the coal mines in this area here. So, typically, I mean, if you have a look at the distances there, on the left, 320 kilometers from Belfast into Matola, where if that coal had to go to Richards Bay, it's nearly 700 kilometers. So, they've got a competitive advantage. Also, if you look at it against trucking, I mean, to truck coal costs you about 950 Rand a ton. And from Transnet, from Ermelo, which is down here, down to Richards Bay, it's 250. So rail is materially cheaper, and Grindrod have got a competitive advantage, certainly from this area, the coal mines in this area. Then this is the Palabora. This is iron ore that comes from Palabora down also into Matola. It's about 460 kilometers. So the corridors of interest to Grindrod is the Maputo corridor, as we've discussed. So that's this one over here. Is the Natcor corridor, which is this one over here. This is the containers and general freight that moves up and down there. The manganese corridor, which is this one over here, bringing manganese into Port Elizabeth. And then the north-south corridor, they already run and have a concession on the Bulawayo to Bight Bridge, and there's a lot of cargoes that move out of Zimbabwe and Zambia that come down through South Africa, which they're very interested in. The ones they're not interested in is the 8 million tons of flow to ArcelorMittal. It's the coal corridor, which has got capacity of 81 million tons, obviously running a lot low at the moment. And the Soldano line, which has got capacity of about 60 million tons and is running at about 50 million tons. Right, so if you look at Grindrod's financials, I mean, something to point out is they have got historically very complex financials, and that's because they run private equity accounting. The good news is all these private equity assets have been sold. So if we look back at the numbers, so if we look at the core business, ports and terminals and logistics, you've got roughly about 2 billion of EBITDA. As I've indicated, we would think that the private sector rail pot is about 36 billion rand potentially going forward. If Grindrod can get 20% of that and at a 35% EBITDA margin, that would imply another 2.5 billion of potential EBITDA. The estimated time frame, the big question is how long does it take them to get into this? We'd expect sort of a 2 to 3 year period. So as we look into kind of 27, 2028, potentially they could be doing 4.5 billion rands worth of EBITDA. I mean, that is kind of plausible. When you look then at the net debt, so if you look back at the financials, you can see net debt here at about 1.5 billion rand. Keep in mind that more recently they've disposed of the North Coast land. They have sold Cockett Marine, and they've still got cash coming in on the UK property, and they're very close to debt free even after you netting off the 35% Matola acquisition which they did. So I mean the question is what's it worth? I'll leave that for you to decide. But they've got an ungeared balance sheet capable of about 6 billion rands of new rail debt that they can take on. Locomotives and wagons typically last 30 to 60 years. They can't get stolen and shouldn't be crashed with modern tracking systems. You've got a large untapped revenue pot with high barriers to entry. You've got customers desperate, the big mining houses desperate for cheap alternatives to trucking. So just to give you an idea, the delta between rail and truck in manganese is 700 rand a ton, and there's 6 million tons of manganese that is currently trucked. There's 26 million tons of coal that was trucked in 2023, just to give you an idea, and that's also on a delta of 700 rand a ton. So if we look at different peer groups, I mean Santos Brazil, it's a port and logistics business. It was recently sold, 17 times PE it was sold for. Rumo Brazil, as I've showed you, trades on 15 times PE. RCTSI, which is the large emerging operator of the Philippines, the guys that are after the Durban port, they trade now 18.5 times PE, but they've got lots of debt. The North American rail operators have PEs up into the 20s, but remember their cost of capital is a lot lower than ours. And that leaves Grindrod on a normalized PE of about 6.5 at the moment with no debt. So if you fast forward as we've shown you a couple of years, that normalized PE is potentially falling down into 3 times. Makes it very, very cheap. So Grindrod is the biggest holding in our Future Titans fund. You can see the performance over the fund over the period. I mean it's a 7.2% weighting in the Future Titans fund. Right, and that concludes the presentation. Again, my name's Brendon Hubbard. There's my mobile number, there's my email address. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.